A neighbor decided to make my life unbearable, and I made her move. My name is Alex. I've been living in a regular small apartment for over a decade now. All this time, I haven't had much trouble with my neighbors, but a year ago, everything changed. I've always tried to be a polite and correct tenant. I clean up after myself. I don't make too much noise in the evenings. I follow all the rules. I try to be inconspicuous. I don't disturb anyone with my presence. After all, we live in the same house, and mutual respect is the basis for a comfortable coexistence. However, with the arrival of Amanda, my new neighbor, a woman of age, the situation has changed dramatically. At first, I thought it was just a temporary difficulty adjusting to a new place to live, but with each passing day, it became clear that she was determined to make my life unbearable. It all started the day she knocked on my door for the first time. It was around 8 in the evening. I had just returned from work and was about to prepare dinner. She appeared on the doorstep with a disgruntled expression on her face and immediately started complaining about the noise. I was surprised. After all, I had just walked into the house and took off my shoes. Noise? What noise? It was ridiculous. I felt like she was deliberately making up things to complain about. But her displeasure didn't stop with that episode. A few days later, she came back to me with another complaint. Now she claimed that my TV was too loud, although I never watch it at full volume. I have always tried to keep quiet, especially in the evening, so her words seemed absolutely ridiculous to me. When I tried to explain to her that the sound of the TV was barely audible even in my room, she just snorted contemptuously and walked away, leaving me bewildered. This episode was the first wake-up call that made me think that something was clearly wrong with Amanda. She was looking for any excuse to pick on me, and each time her claims became more and more absurd. It seemed that she just liked to create conflict situations, perhaps to make herself feel important or powerful over someone. After this incident, I began to pay attention to her behavior. Sometimes I would catch her gaze through the window when I was out in the yard. She would look at me with some strange interest, as if trying to find another reason for conflict. Sometimes she would stand at my apartment door for long periods of time, listening to every rustle in the entryway. This created a feeling of constant tension, as if I was under a microscope. Her complaints continued. She claimed that I left garbage near the entrance, although I always made sure that everything was cleaned up. Then suddenly she started talking about unpleasant odors coming from my apartment, although there were no odors other than the usual aroma of food. Every time I tried to object or explain the situation, she either ignored my words or walked away, leaving me in a state of confusion and irritation. Her claims became more and more absurd. One day she claimed that she could hear me talking to myself at night, even though it was impossible. I was asleep. At some point, I began to feel guilty for no reason, like I was really doing something wrong. But inside me, irritation was growing. Why should I put up with these unfair accusations? These thoughts were giving me anxiety. I realized that I couldn't go on like this. Either I would find a way to deal with this situation, or it would completely ruin my life. One evening, when Amanda showed up at my door again to complain about another noise, I decided that enough was enough. I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, and looked at her seriously. I said, trying to control the tone of my voice, that if she was so uncomfortable living next to me, maybe she should consider moving, or go to the police if she thought I was breaking the law by my actions. My words came out clear and confident. She froze in place, her face pale. For a few seconds, she stared at me in silence, as if trying to realize how serious I was. Then without a word, she turned and left, slamming the door loudly. That night I felt relieved, as if a heavy weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to relax and enjoy the silence. But the joy was short-lived. The next day she came back with new complaints that were even more absurd. So I decided to do something different. Instead of trying to justify myself to her, I began to tell the other neighbors how she was always inventing reasons for conflict. I told them that her claims were completely unfounded and that she was a troublemaker. Of course, at first, many people took my words with disbelief. They were used to seeing Amanda as a respectable older woman, and the idea that she could behave in such a way seemed strange to them. But gradually, the situation began to change. Neighbors began to notice that Amanda was indeed behaving unusually. Some recalled hearing her arguing with the janitor over imaginary trash. Others noticed that she sometimes yells at passers-by who walk by our house or makes remarks to children playing in the yard. Even those who used to treat her neutrally have begun to wonder about her behavior. Rumors about her strange behavior began to spread quickly. People began to discuss her among themselves, exchanging stories about the ridiculous claims she was making. The atmosphere around her began to change. Those who had previously interacted with her in a friendly manner began to avoid meeting her. Some stopped saying hello when meeting her, pretending not to notice her presence. Gradually, communication with Amanda began to be perceived as something undesirable, unpleasant. The atmosphere in the house began to heat up. Each new incident involving Amanda only aggravated the situation. She felt that the attitude towards her was changing, but instead of reconsidering her behavior, she continued to insist on her own. Her attempts to prove her point only served to alienate the neighbors. Gradually, the tension reached a breaking point. No one wanted anything to do with her anymore. People tried to avoid her apartment, avoiding any contact with her. Eventually, the atmosphere around her became so heavy and unfriendly that no one wanted to be around her. After a couple of months, I noticed that the number of complaints dropped dramatically. Month after month went by, and I ran into Amanda less and less often. At first, I thought she had just changed her tactics, deciding to leave me alone. But then one day I noticed that her apartment looked empty. The windows were closed, the lights were off, and her voice was no longer heard on the landing. Another month passed, and then one day I met one of our mutual neighbor acquaintances. He told me the news I never expected to hear. Amanda had moved. Turns out she packed up and left without notifying any of the neighbors. The move raised a lot of questions, but no one knew exactly why she made that decision. There were different rumors. Some said that she was simply tired of living in a house where no one respected her. Others speculated that she had personal problems that forced her to change her residence. But most agreed that the atmosphere around her had become so heavy and unfriendly that it was unbearable for her to stay here. However, her departure came as a surprise to many. After so many months of strained relationships and constant conflict, her sudden disappearance was a relief to everyone. Life in our house gradually returned to normal. Neighbors began to communicate with each other again without fear of encountering a new scandal. Now looking back, I realized that I did not do the right thing. Perhaps I should have tried to solve the problem peacefully, to talk to her frankly. But at the time I was so irritated that I acted on instinct. My patience ran out and I chose the path of least resistance, hoping that public opinion would play against her. This story taught me many things. First, you don't always have to justify yourself to those who are looking for a reason to accuse you. One should not waste energy on endless explanations and excuses if the person is intentionally trying to create conflict. It is better to remain calm and confident in your actions. Second, it is important to be able to protect your boundaries. You cannot let other people invade your personal space and dictate the conditions of life. You need to be able to say no and stand your ground, even if it causes discontent of others. Finally, sometimes it is better to resolve conflicts directly than to resort to rumors and manipulation. Open and honest conversation often helps to avoid unnecessary complications and misunderstandings. Even if it seems that the person you are talking to is not ready to listen, trying to engage in a dialogue can be fruitful. Life goes on, and I try to remember that lesson. I hope that such situations will not arise again. But if something like that happens, I will try to approach the problem with more patience.